If you watched my last episode from last week, you'll remember the heartbreaking story of Stayner, a young boy abducted at just 7 years old who managed to escape his captor after 7 years of deep brainwashing and save another child in the process. This is a story of resilience and courage, but also one of immense tragedy for the Stayner family. But the Stayner story does not end there. It takes an even darker, even more deeply unsettling turn. Today we're shifting focus to Stephen's older brother, Cary Stayner, who went on to become the Yosemite Killer, a serial killer. How does one family endure so much pain, and how does somebody go from being a quiet, unassuming kid with a kidnapped younger brother to a name synonymous with horror and pain? Cary's story is one that forces us to talk about trauma, loss, and the darker corners of the human mind. So today we'll unpack everything that led to Cary's crimes and explore the tragic connections between these two brothers whose lives took such vastly different paths. So let's dive in. If you want extra context here, I would advise you to go and watch or listen to last week's episode about Stephen Stayner. It will be linked down below, both my YouTube video and my podcast episode, because it's kind of impossible to talk about Cary Stayner without acknowledging the shadow cast by his younger brother's abduction and eventual return. For years, the Stayner family was thrust into the public eye, with Stephen's story celebrated as a rare glimmer of hope in a world that's often defined by unresolved tragedies. Stephen experienced true, deep trauma, like the kind of trauma that so few people actually have to go through. He was kept captive by a paedophile for 7 years. He was subjected to deep brainwashing that made him question who he was, question his entire past. But then he turned up alive and relatively unharmed. He went home to his family. It was a miracle. And the Stayners continued on with their lives, reunited as if nothing had happened. But behind the scenes, life wasn't as picture perfect as it may have seemed. Carrie, the oldest sibling left behind, grew up in the same household, but carried his own burdens. He had this grief, this anger, and feelings of invisibility. Whilst Stephen became the centre of attention, both whilst he was gone and when he returned, Cary's struggles went unnoticed. He was just kind of like simmering beneath the surface until they erupted in a really horrifying way. In his captivity, Stephen was still allowed to attend high school, and he was a very popular kid. He had plenty of friends, he had a girlfriend, he was on the football team, he was doing very well in school. Like, from the outside, you would have thought that Stephen was thriving. He wasn't. He was dealing with horrors at home that you never would want to go through, but you wouldn't have known that from the outside. Cary, however, attending Merced High School, was always known as the kid whose brother was kidnapped. Cary was a very talented artist. He was always drawing cartoons. He was voted as most creative in his yearbook. He always wore a hat, which people thought at the time was just a very quirky fashion choice, but it was actually because he had trichotillomania. He compulsively pulled his hair out. Cary was always dealing with a lot of invisible demons. The Stayner family as a whole had obviously been massively affected by Stephen's disappearance in 1972. The family consisted of parents Kay and Dell and 5 children. Cary was the oldest, then they had a daughter, then Stephen, then 2 more daughters. Cary and Stephen, being the only 2 boys, grew up incredibly close. They were apparently best friends as kids. They shared a room, they were friends, they played together constantly. They were just about as close as any brothers could be. And when Stephen was kidnapped in December 1972, Cary's life was turned upside down. And as with so many adults during this time period in the 70s, Dell and Kay Stayner didn't have the best hold on their emotions. You didn't go to therapy or counselling in 1972. That was seen as weak and embarrassing. No, you just put on a brave face and carried on as normal. You didn't let the outside world see your struggles. And that's not to say they weren't broken, because they definitely were. Like, Dell was apparently hugely affected by his son's disappearance. The family spent hours and hours handing out missing persons flyers. They travelled all around the country following rumours of people who might have potentially known something, but eventually it just got too much. I mean, the family couldn't even watch the news in case Stephen was mentioned, and it would cause Dell to break down. And Kay, the mum, who was always considered to be somewhat of a colder kind of woman, apparently just shut down into that even further. The children couldn't speak freely about their feelings, their thoughts, their emotions. It wasn't necessarily met with kindness. They just had to trudge on through. And I'm not saying by any means that the parents didn't care, because of course they did. Like, they searched endlessly for their son. They felt huge feelings of guilt. Like, was there something they could have done that might have prevented this? But they just didn't express their emotions in the healthiest way. And when you've got 4 other children to continue to raise, well, that definitely does have a ripple effect. Carrie reportedly felt very neglected during this time. Like, most of the family's attention and energy was understandably focused on their search for Stephen, and this manifested in Carrie in anxiety, which then manifested in obsessive compulsive tendencies, the pulling out of his own hair. He had been diagnosed with trichotillomania as a very young kid, I think around 3 years old, but any kind of anxiety always tended to worsen it, and well, this was a pretty severe kind of anxiety. Cary quickly changed from a relatively normal kid to very socially awkward and shy. He just retreated into himself, and he never really made any efforts to seek out connections. He was just quiet, he was an outsider, and he never ever openly discussed the trauma of his brother's abduction. Everyone's attention was on Stephen, and no one really paid that much attention to Cary, but he missed his brother desperately. A childhood friend would tell ABC News in a 1999 interview that he'd heard stories about how Cary would go out and wish on a star that his brother would come home. And so the years just passed. It is probably important to say that whilst Cary was always considered to be a bit weird, a bit socially inept perhaps, he was never overtly violent. However, he did seem to have compulsion to expose himself to women. There were occasions where he exposed himself to his sister's friends. He seemed to want to be able to get close to women, but he completely lacked the social skills to be able to actually do so. So instead, he just exposed himself and get his sexual thrills through that. Some sources say that Cary had no real interest in girls, and perhaps the two things can be true hand in hand. Perhaps to Cary at this time as a teenager, only his sexual needs were important. Perhaps it was the thrill of the exposure that got him going, and not the actual girls. He was just a creep, a loner. And then in 1980, Stephen suddenly returns back home. The family as a whole were overjoyed. Dell and Kay immediately get Stephen back into the swing of family life, and they move him straight back into a room with his older brother. And there was a decent age gap between the two of them. Like, Cary was 4 years older than Stephen, which isn't really loads in the grand scheme of things, but at 14 years old and 18 years old, that's pretty significant. Like, you're at two very different stages of life at 14 and 18. Immediately from the get-go here, Cary is now sharing a room with somebody that he doesn't know, who is essentially a stranger. And this wasn't even a normal case of a kidnapped child returning home, if there can even be such a thing. Stephen was returning to his family as a hero after saving a 5-year-old boy from his same fate in the process. Stephen was catapulted to national fame, and within just days of returning home, he was featuring on shows like Good Morning America, talking about his whole ordeal. The whole family, the media, the country was focused on Stephen, and the rest of his siblings just got pushed to the side. And Dell and Kay didn't even get Stephen into therapy after all of this. There was very little hope for his siblings, for Cary, to have the professional help to deal with everything that was going on with them. When Stephen returned home, there was a press conference held outside the Stayner house, in which the entire family seemed to be overjoyed. This was a celebration, everyone was smiling. Apart from one person. In the back of the video, you can see Cary in his signature baseball cap, and he just looks absolutely miserable. Cary had always felt a bit invisible in a household dominated by grief, but now that Stephen was back, that invisibility took on a whole new level. Cary felt neglected and resentful, especially when his brother was flung back into his space, into his bedroom. Now they were both teenagers, they were back to sharing a room, and they didn't have the closeness that they'd once shared. They were strangers to each other. I mean, Stephen even said that upon his return he recognised his parents immediately, but he had no clue who his siblings were. So Cary retreated further and further into himself. He got increasingly isolated. As he graduated high school, he fell into a number of low-paying jobs that he could never really seem to hold down for very long. Jobs like a handyman or a maintenance worker, but they would never really last. However, there was one place that filled Cary with peace, and that was Yosemite National Park. I do wonder if there was some parallel between Cary knowing that this is where Stephen had been taken when he was first kidnapped, and that's maybe why he felt drawn towards it. But whenever life was getting too much, Cary would just drive to Yosemite and get lost in nature. He would go into the mountains, he would smoke weed, he would skinny dip. He was very big apparently on getting high in nature. Apparently this brought him a lot of peace. He made friends in the park, female friends, who said he never tried anything untoward with them. He never made them feel uncomfortable. Cary Stayner just seemed like a perfectly nice and normal guy, if a bit shy, a bit quiet. At this point in time, Cary Stayner was definitely a guy with his demons, but they were under control, or at least as far as anyone on the outside was aware. After high school, Cary moved in with his uncle Jesse or Jerry Stayner. Jerry also lived in Merced, where the family was from, and Cary wasn't exactly thriving living at home with his family. He wasn't the easiest person to live with these sort of like psychological struggles bubbling under the surface. Cary very much had no direction in life, and Uncle Jerry was described as a kind and generous man. He was very willing to help his nephew when he was a bit stuck, so he moved him in. But then in December 1990, just the year after Stephen died in a tragic motorcycle accident, Jerry Stayner was murdered in his home. He was shot. He'd popped home from work for lunch and he was shot with his own gun. Later on, a friend was driving by and noticed the door was wide open, came in to investigate and found Jerry's body. At the time, Cary was interviewed as part of the investigation just because he lived there, not as a suspect. But Jerry's case, Jerry's murder, was never solved. There was some talk of this being a robbery gone wrong or being the work of a neighbour, but we just don't know. Like I said, it's unsolved. When years later the news came out about Cary now being a serial killer, the murder of his uncle was looked at in an entirely new light. Was Cary the one responsible? The assistant sheriff asked the marshal to take another look at this case to see if there were any potential connections there, but the people who knew Cary and Jerry said they just didn't believe it. The pair were always very close and they got along really well. So around the time of his uncle's death, Cary has 2 nervous breakdowns. He starts getting very violent with very violent fantasies. In 1995, after one of the breakdowns, he was admitted to a mental institution. But apart from that one interview, Cary really didn't have many run-ins with the police. Jumping forward a couple of years to March 1997, he was arrested at his mobile home on drug charges. That was possession of marijuana and possession of methamphetamines. He was booked into the Merced County Jail on 4 narcotics allegations. It was 3 felonies and 1 misdemeanor, but he was released a few days later without any charge, and that was it. So that same year, probably wanting to just escape to his favourite place, Cary gets a job as a handyman at the Cedar Lodge. This was about an hour and a half away from Merced. It was 7 miles from the entrance of the national park. His mental health problems were getting worse, and instead of getting help, he just ran into nature, and getting a job here at the lodge gave him constant access. But he really did need medical help because it's around this time that he really begins to spiral out of control. Since childhood, Cary had been obsessed with Bigfoot or Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. He had been convinced since he was a kid that he'd spotted Bigfoot in a very remote area of Yosemite, and that had now turned into a full-blown obsession as an adult. At his later trial, a psychiatrist testified that he was enamoured with Bigfoot, that he worshipped it like a religious figure. I mean, even as he sat in court on murder charges, Cary was sat there sketching away on a notepad in front of him, and he was sketching Bigfoot. Apparently he fully believed that Bigfoot was tied to the meaning of life. He told anyone who would listen that Bigfoot was real and that he'd seen him. It really was a complete obsession. So now working at the Cedar Lodge, a hotel on the gateway of Yosemite, was a really great base for him. Cary was a very keen runner and he would spend hours running through the mountains just hoping for another glimpse. Cedar Lodge is a 206-room motel on Highway 140, the road that leads directly back to Merced. Cary worked there as a maintenance worker, he worked the swing shift, and he lived next door in an apartment above the bar. Cary was considered to be a very good worker, a very good employee. He was quiet, but he was always quiet. And he turned up on time, he was good at maintenance, he could fix almost anything, no problem. He was polite to the guests, he was very clean cut, like they had no problems with him as an employee. And it really did seem from the outside that Cary found peace in Yosemite. He continued smoking weed and skinny dipping. He had a group of friends or maybe acquaintances that he'd meet up with to get high. He also spent a lot of time naked, it was kind of what he was known for. Cary was a very common sight around this area of Yosemite, like everyone knew him and his truck. He drove a baby blue 1979 International Scout with white stripes and mismatched tyres. It was a very memorable kind of car. Each night, Cary would sit at the bar and chat with the tourists coming in and out of the area. He wasn't the kind of killer who gave people goosebumps when they met him. Like, people didn't walk away from interactions with Cary being like, there's something wrong with that guy. He was sure a bit odd, but people didn't pin him as a serial killer, although I suppose that's the case with most killers. Like, most people you wouldn't know is a killer. Cary in general at this time was quite well liked, although there was one woman called Trish who later spoke to ABC about this case. She ran the restaurant at Cedar Lodge with her husband, and she described how she would catch Cary staring at their teenage daughter Jen at the pool. And soon the pair were going for long walks together and Cary was inviting Jen back to his apartment. Jen thought her mother was being very dramatic in her hate for Cary, like she was 17 now, she could make her own decisions. But after being invited back to his apartment, which apparently was like perfectly sanitized, it was almost sterile, it was very clean, very soulless, Jen said she got this terrible feeling in her chest, like something felt really off. And then he started to go off on a rant about his sisters, and Jen was like, nope, I'm getting out of here, and she left. She finally saw what her mother had been seeing. Trish described Cary as very cold and hateful, but she found it super frustrating because everyone else seemed to really love him. Nobody else could see what she was seeing. I mean, even at baseline level here, Cary was in his mid-30s, so why was he chasing after a 17-year-old girl? And then you've got the whole added, he would go on to become a serial killer thing on top of that. For 2 years, Cary lived and worked at Cedar Lodge without any problems whatsoever, but his mental state was spiralling out of control. Unbeknownst to everyone, he was having increasingly violent fantasies. He was harbouring this real hatred towards women, and all he could think about was hurting them. And in February 1999, he finally acted on those fantasies. That winter had been a particularly rough one in Yosemite. There weren't many tourists, there really wasn't much to do. So Cary decided to finally do what he'd been thinking about doing for so long. 42-year-old Carol Sund, her 16-year-old daughter Julie Sund, and her friend Silvina Peloso had decided to take a trip to Yosemite for just a few days. Silvina was from Argentina, she was the daughter of one of Carol's close friends. Silvina and Julie were really good friends, so she'd come to spend her winter break in Eureka, California with the Sunds just to get away for a bit, just for a little trip. And wanting to show Silvina the best of the USA, the incredible natural beauty, they decided to take a short trip to Yosemite and booked a stay at Cedar Lodge. The room they got assigned at the lodge was actually about as far away from the lobby as you could possibly get. It was in the 500 block and it was very, very quiet. Their rental car, a red Pontiac, was pretty much the only car in the whole car park or parking lot. Out of 206 rooms in this lodge, only 20 were booked on that night, so it was very, very quiet. All the rooms were really spread out. You weren't seeing anyone else. On the night of the 13th of February, the three settled into room 509, ready for a girly night of watching movies and chatting away, when they got a knock on the door. It was a maintenance worker telling Carol that he needed to come in and fix a leak behind the bathroom wall, and the maintenance worker, you can probably realise, was Cary Stayner. Carol had no reason to think that he wasn't telling the truth, and Cary would later say how he'd spotted how quiet the lodge was that night. He saw the curtain of room 509 open, the window open, he saw 3 women in there without a man, and he just decided to act. When he entered the room, Cary went into the bathroom and pulled a gun out of his toolbox. It was a .22 caliber pistol. He went back into the room, pointing the gun at Carol, saying, "This is only a robbery, no one's going to get hurt." And all of them decided to believe him. Carol allowed Cary to tie her wrists and cover her mouth with duct tape, and then he tied up Julie and Sylvina and locked them in the bathroom. As soon as they were in there, he attacked Carol, pushing her down onto the bed and strangling her. He killed her just to know what it felt like to kill someone. Next, he dragged Sylvina out of the bathroom and killed her in the same way, also placing her body in the boot of the Pontiac. And then it was Julie's turn. I don't wish to repeat the details of what he did to Julie, but she did endure hours of sexual abuse. He then bundled her into the car while she was still alive, and off they drove into the mountains. They reached an area called Moccasin Point overlooking a reservoir, and he pushed Julie into the pine trees. He then tried to assault her again, and then he killed her. He originally tried to cut her throat but said it was too slow a death, so then he shot her and just left her on her own up there to die, just loosely covered with some brush. She must have been so scared. He then drove the Pontiac to an old logging road off of Highway 108, intending to hide the car somewhere deep within the forest where it wouldn't be found for a really long time. However, he got the car stuck on a tree stump only a few hundred yards away from the main road. It was very near a place called Long Barn. And this car was nowhere near as hidden as he wanted it to be, but it was near daylight and he needed to escape this scene. So he walked 2 miles to a payphone and just ordered a taxi. It took a couple of days for Carol, Julie and Sylvina to be reported as missing, and in that time, Cary drove back to where he'd abandoned the Pontiac and set it on fire, trying to destroy any evidence. When the trio were originally reported as missing, it wasn't immediately assumed that foul play had been involved because the lodge had been so empty. There hadn't been any witnesses to confirm when the Pontiac left the parking lot, so there was a chance that they'd just gone off for a hike in the mountains and they'd gotten lost. Like, investigators didn't know if they were looking for 3 missing hikers or something much worse. But 5 days after their disappearance, Carol's wallet was found in the middle of an intersection in Modesto. Little did police know that Cary had purposefully dropped the wallet there in order to throw off the investigation. This was an hour's drive west of where the bodies actually were. But the wallet set the police on the trail of this maybe being a case of robbery, maybe it was a robbery gone wrong, maybe it was a murder. It was assumed by this point at least that the trio were definitely dead and somebody else was involved, but that's all they knew. And the bodies wouldn't be found for over a month. On March 18th, a hiker stumbled across the charred remains of the Pontiac and called the finding into the police. In the boot, they found 2 bodies burned beyond recognition, and dental records were used to confirm that they were the remains of Carol and Sylvina. So now they finally knew this was a case of murder, but there wasn't any sign of Julie anywhere in the area. This discovery was obviously covered extensively in the local media, and it didn't take long for Cary to find out that his crimes had been uncovered. And for whatever reason, he couldn't just leave it there. He wrote a letter to the FBI, the top of it reading, "We had fun with this one," along with a hand-drawn map detailing Julie's location. And sure enough, it led investigators directly to her body. Cary even got another man to lick the envelope so there'd be no trace of his DNA on it, and then dropped it in a mailbox in Stockton, which is another hour north of Modesto, again just trying to throw investigators off. And the use of the word "we" in the note, "we had fun with this one," led them down the trail of criminal gangs. They thought that maybe more than one person was responsible for this. And they were looking in the cities for the perpetrator, not in Yosemite itself. Of course though, after the discovery of the bodies, the FBI did come to Cedar Lodge to talk to the staff there. I mean, it was the last place the women had been seen alive, and Cary was super helpful. He answered all their questions very openly. He didn't seem to be hiding anything. He opened the door for the forensic team to take a look in the room. They just really didn't think anything of this very helpful, clean-cut guy who had zero criminal record, zero criminal history. But little did they know that he was already planning a second or fourth murder. He wanted to do it again. And there were chances. There was a woman he was sleeping with over that summer that he would later tell the authorities that he had a fantasy about killing, but for whatever reason, he didn't see it through. He also had a girlfriend in this time as well, a waitress at Cedar Lodge who had 2 children, and apparently he would absolutely spoil the children. He bought them presents, he bought them Beanie Babies. Years later, one of the children, who is now an adult, Lena, spoke to ABC News about her experience with Cary, saying that the mother went with him because he seemed really safe. He taught the children how to dive, he drew them cartoons, he seemed like a really friendly guy. She described him as a big teddy bear. But Lena also told ABC News how Cary would always carry a backpack with him, like wherever he went he had this backpack, and the FBI have since said that this backpack contained his entire murder kit. There was duct tape and weapons. Cary would later confess to the FBI that he'd wanted to kill the mum and rape and kill the children, and he had actually tried on 3 separate occasions to do so, and for whatever reason, thank God, he failed every time. But then he came across Joy Armstrong. Joy was a 26-year-old naturalist who worked with the Yosemite Institute, teaching tourists about the incredible natural beauty of the park. On the 21st of July, Cary is driving through the park down Forester Road when he catches a sight of Joy outside her cabin. And this was a pretty special area for Cary. It really wasn't far from where he'd spotted Bigfoot all those years earlier. This area had a spiritual meaning to him, and he took it as a sign. He pulled over and said hi to Joy before going to a nearby creek and throwing rocks. He watched her go in and out of her cabin trying to work out if she was alone, and once he'd figured out that she was, he grabbed her. Joy put up a battle, like she fought for her life, but he was bigger and stronger. He managed to get duct tape around her wrist and got her into the truck, but she managed to get out as the truck was moving and she ran for her life. Cary was furious. He ran after her and tackled her to the ground. He raped her and then slit her throat, but he didn't stop there. In his rage, he beheaded her entirely. His fantasy was that this was supposed to be easy. His victims weren't supposed to fight back, but Joy did, and it made him mad. And Cary wasn't careful about this crime. Like, he had been kind of careful in the first, like he'd not left behind any obvious evidence, but in this one he left behind endless evidence, but he just didn't really seem to care. I mean, even his red hat was left in the cabin and he didn't go back and get it. He left behind tyre tracks, he left behind scuff marks, there was DNA. At this point it just seems like he wanted to kill. He didn't care about hiding it. He also didn't take much care to hide Joy's body. It was found the very next day. Very soon, an eyewitness, a Yosemite firefighter, reported seeing a very distinctive International Scout truck parked on the side of Forester Road, and this led detectives directly to the name Cary Stayner, only he was no longer at Cedar Lodge. They put out a bulletin on the 7 o'clock news saying that Cary Stayner was wanted by the FBI for questioning, and if anyone knew where he was, to get in contact. And one woman, a woman named Janet, did know exactly where he was. She was staying at a nudist resort just outside of Sacramento called Laguna del Sol, and Cary was also there. She'd been chatting to him just the night before. So within minutes of seeing this broadcast on the news, she called the police, and soon Cary was being arrested. Once he was arrested, there was no wall of silence, there was no denial. He started speaking almost immediately, and it seemed like he couldn't really stop. Perhaps he knew there was no use in trying to talk his way out of this, like he knew that he'd left endless evidence behind. He led the FBI to Forester and walked them through the crime of Joy's murder step by step. And then he also easily confessed to being responsible for the murders of Carol, Julie and Sylvina. Perhaps he knew it was only a matter of time before they pinned that on him as well because, well, he worked at the lodge. From his jail cell, Cary told a television reporter about his crimes in detail, and then he also wrote a letter to the local paper, the Fresno Bee, saying that they should buy his story so he could give some money to the victims' families. He wrote, "I realised the money would be little consolation for the loss of their loved one, but until the jury, judge and the executioner fulfil their role in this matter, it's all I can offer." But don't be mistaken, it's not because he was trying to be a good guy, he just liked the notoriety. For Joy's murder, Cary was charged in federal court. This happened on federal land, so it fell under federal jurisdiction. The charges in Joy's case included first-degree murder, kidnapping resulting in death, and attempted sexual assault. He was charged in California State Court for the murders of Carol, Julie, and Sylvina. That was 3 counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual assault, and the state added enhancements to the charges as well, including murder during the commission of kidnapping and murder during the commission of sexual assault, all of which made him eligible for the death penalty. The federal court trial for Joy's murder happened first in 2001. In an attempt to avoid the death sentence, he pleaded guilty on all charges and he cried on the stand apologising. He said, "I wish I could take it back, but I can't. I wish I could tell you why I did such a thing, but I don't even know myself. I'm so sorry. I wish there was a reason, but there isn't. It's senseless." Which doesn't really mean much after you've not only murdered a woman, but also beheaded her in sheer anger. Joy's mum, who was in court, did say that she did believe the apology was genuine though, so I hope that maybe did bring her some element of peace. In Joy's murder, Cary Stayner was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the other 3 murders, Cary pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity in 2002. His lawyers claimed that he had a history of sexual abuse, alluding to him being abused by a family friend when he was a young teenager, and severe mental illness. We know about his trichotillomania, we know about his obsessive-compulsive disorder, but psychiatrists here also testified that he may have had schizophrenia and mild autism. Lots of people have these diagnoses though, and they don't become serial killers. The defence argued that all of this was compounded by the trauma of his brother's abduction and death and the murder of his uncle, and this all apparently diminished his capacity to control his actions. They sought to avoid the death penalty by portraying him as this just deeply, deeply troubled person rather than a cold-blooded killer. But regardless, on August 27, 2002, he was found to be sane and was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of kidnapping. He was sentenced to death. But we all know how long execution takes. This was over 22 years ago now, and Cary Stayner is still alive. He's still on death row. He's 63 years old and currently incarcerated at San Quentin State Prison in California, where there have been no executions since 2006. There was a court ruling over the flaws of administration of capital punishment in the state, and therefore it just hasn't really happened since. So it does seem like death row is where Cary is to stay for the foreseeable future. Cary has since said that what he did was his choice and no one else's. He said he doesn't blame Ken Parnell, the man who kidnapped his brother. He doesn't blame his parents. He said it's always been his responsibility and his alone. And he may well think that may well be true, but this case is an excellent look at nature versus nurture. There's no way of knowing the alternative, but in a world maybe where Stephen hadn't been kidnapped, where his uncle hadn't been murdered, where Cary may have had a bit more attention as he grew up, as a kid, as a teenager, would he still have committed the crimes that he did? Well, that's the age-old question, I suppose. Was he always destined, fated to be this way? Was he always going to be a killer regardless of what happened to him growing up? Or could it have been avoided? There is question over whether Cary was responsible for more crimes than what he admitted to. There are multiple women who went missing around this area in the years that he was active, but there's no solid connections, there's only speculation. Some officers who were involved in this case believe that he may have had more victims. Other officers believe that he would have confessed immediately. He confessed to the rest, why would he not confess to these ones? The story of the Stayner family is just a tragic one beginning to end. You could argue that Stephen went through something way worse than what Cary did, and he didn't end up being that way. Like, Stephen was kidnapped, he was abused for 7 years, and he managed to get his life together. Cary was just a bit neglected emotionally as a kid, and he didn't go through half the stuff that Stephen did. So was this always in Cary's blood? Was this fate always written for him in the stars? Stephen's story is one of survival and bravery, whilst Cary's is one of violence and despair, a dichotomy that highlights just how complex and fragile life can be. As we look back on their story, it's a very sobering reminder of how trauma kind of ripples through lives in a way that can't always be understood. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you like what I'm doing here on this channel, then please do not forget to leave a comment down below, give this video a thumbs up, subscribe, all that kind of stuff, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.